All right, well, welcome folks online and folks in person. Just want to welcome you on behalf of the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights. We're super excited to have our guest John Packer here with us. We were just talking yesterday. I've known John over the years, many years, but we've never met in person until recently in Winnipeg, and we've seen each other 3 times since, which is so strange, which is beautiful because it's been nice to get to know John, and so thanks for coming. But the John Humphrey Center, I just want to, first acknowledge this view that we have. I know folks online you can't see, but 12th floor of the Henry Marshall Torrey building overlooking is so incredibly beautiful, but it does remind me of those folks that have been displaced from this territory. So the Papas Chase First Nation, used to roam and farm or, harvest these lands, and it was a really sacred space. There's actually there's known to be a mass grave site just further down the White Mud in terms of Papas Chase Nation. There's a film called Reconciliation by Jamie Bork. He's from Buffalo Lake Métis settlements, and his family was part of that Papas Chase that was pushed out, forcefully displaced. And that's one nation that never really got recognition. And they own a gas station on the south side of Edmonton. But I think it's really important as we do this work, and we're going to be talking about transnational repression today, that we understand that oppression and the genocide that exists right here in our own lands, and how that plays out, how that I was telling Dominic this morning that I just got back from Thompson, Manitoba, and just when you think you know things in this world and experience them, but Thompson, Manitoba, I think was one of my most difficult trips on the heart that I've had, I think, in my life. Even though I've traveled internationally in that, because we were they asked us to come up and do training on advocacy using human rights mechanisms in the healthcare system. We were invited up by an Indigenous doctor and an Indigenous nurse and some Indigenous advocates, and to be sitting in a room with 15 cohorts in the team, and 5 of them moms who've lost children to negligence, racism in the healthcare system over the last 6 months. One guy, his brother, in really bad condition due to his experience in the health system. And it just was really heavy and really heartbreaking. And just, when we're thinking about the land in this place, we've all been blessed. We've all been so blessed to have the opportunities to, myself being in this building again and taking me back to doing my master's of political science here, and how lucky and privileged and how fortunate been able to grow and be a part of this land and this territory in Treaty 6. So I just want to ground us there. And the John Humphrey Center is really about an organization working to kind of shine lights on those difficult truths. And we just really appreciate this space and appreciate all of you. So I wanted to invite my colleague Netta Phillett from the Interfaith Center to bring a few words. Netta is like a core partner of the John Humphrey Center from the Interfaith Center. We've been working for years together, trying to build bridges, and this year we're really excited because we're going to get to do this Peace Builder program again. And this Peace Builder program was something we designed many years ago, where we create these spaces where young people, when I say young people, it's usually like in their early 20s, are coming together across faith backgrounds and really going out to the gurdwaras or the synagogues and engaging in conversations, difficult conversations that really look at social cohesion as a focus. So I just want to welcome Netta, and I've asked her to say a few words, and then we'll introduce John.
Thank you, Renee. And if I'm going to say something personal first, my mother was born 2 blocks away from here, and her parents came up from the States in 1895, when there wasn't in Alberta. The Dominion of Canada was welcoming homesteaders and giving away land basically free. And I can guarantee you that as white Europeans, they never thought for 1 second about who might have been here before them. I'm sure that was not in their consciousness at all. So I'm ever mindful of that. So good morning. I am Netta Phillett, Executive Director of the Edmonton Interfaith Center for Education and Action. As we celebrate our 30th anniversary, we are very proud of our long-standing and ongoing partnership with the John Humphrey Center, the city's foremost human rights organization. For all these years, we have been working side by side with different focus but similar goals to promote the reality that pluralism and diversity are among our greatest strengths and must be embraced. The Edmonton Interfaith Center approaches this through one aspect of our complex identities, promoting religious literacy. The more we know about each other, the more we will respect, understand, and experience true harmony. We learn about each other from each other. With half our board of directors having been born outside of Canada, we are well placed to appreciate the tensions of which Professor Packer will speak. Sadly, our work and that of the John Humphrey Centre are needed now more than ever to a degree that many of us could not have foreseen 30 years ago, and maybe that's just as well. Too many leaders, both political and religious, are deliberately dividing us for their own goals, sowing fear, scapegoating the other. Solidarity and awareness are needed. In February, we held an inaugural interfaith breakfast attended by 130 guests. The theme, Belonging in a Time of Uncertainty, reflected the concerns we are facing to continue to demonstrate that we all belong. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Netta. All right, we have some newcomers that's coming in. So with that, no further ado, I will welcome John Packer from the University of Ottawa. I know John was the director of the Human Rights Research Education Center for decades.
12 years.
12 years, okay, 12 years. And I know has been making an indelible impact in Ottawa, but also just his braveness, his boldness to speak out on issues that I think a lot of folks aren't talking about, and just your international experience, John. I'm just super grateful for you taking the time to be here. I know it's summertime, the academic crowd is a bit lower, but we have a crew online, and just welcome you all. And John will talk, and then we'll open up and we'll have space for dialogue and questions. Folks online, I just have you all muted so that we don't have background noise, but as soon as we start the discussion, we'll open up and we'll go from there. So with that, no further ado, here we go.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you also on behalf of the Interfaith Center for those remarks, which I think are also good for all of us to think about, where we came from, where we're going, what our relationships. So first of all, I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a moment, but a couple preliminary remarks. This is my second time at the University of Alberta. I was here 44 years ago when I was 21 years old as a student in a debating competition, Western Canadian debating competition. So I barely remember it. And I can tell you that it's always remarkable to me, the speed of development, the increase in the size of the city, the communities, the diversity, and so forth. I'm originally from Winnipeg, born and raised in Winnipeg. My parents were immigrants, like many parents, many of my peers, and had probably similar kind of perceptions at the time. And my parents actually emigrated from India, but my parents were British, and after they were part of the Indian Army and stayed in India after independence and came here in 1950. And my father thought he was coming as part of the colonial British Empire, that he could just home Canada. He discovered he couldn't. There was a whole kind of moment of realization. And they ended up, they went to Vancouver, and they later joined the Canadian Army and ended up in Shiloh, Manitoba, a Canadian Armed Forces base. And then as the 50s changed and opportunities increased, they moved to the city, Winnipeg, and that's where they established a family. But even in Winnipeg, I mean, first of all, when I was a kid, Winnipeg was the fourth largest city in Canada, larger than Edmonton and Calgary. Calgary was a small place, if you might remember, when I was a kid driving through as a child. You would go past on the Trans-Canada Highway, and it was somewhere further away. It's not how it is anymore. But the diversity of the character of the communities and the populations also changed substantially. Winnipeg, as you may know, had a substantial, particularly East European immigration. And so I grew up, eating Polish and Ukrainian food and Icelandic food, and but also the idea of belonging. People had to forge that. But I will say, with regard to Indigenous peoples, which is not what we called them at the time, in our Constitution, we call them Aboriginal. But at the time when I was a kid, we didn't call them that either. They were the Indians. And you may also know in Canadian law, we still use this term. So it was a visible reality that there was a deep divide. And that divide was not only a kind of we-they, that was also cultural. it was also palpably one of unequal opportunity, of poverty. We didn't have a lot of poverty, but the poverty amongst the Indigenous people was visible. You may know, I'm not sure what the population ratio is in Alberta, but in Manitoba, there's a substantial percentage of the population is Indigenous. And so it's also kind of hard to ignore. But we did, and that's something I want to just underline, is that it was routine to ignore it, actually. Somehow we mentally just shifted it out of our minds. And I think this is relevant to the conversation we'll have today, because it's something about relationships in the world. And when I was a child, it was very clear that many people, as I mentioned, East Europeans, had come fleeing their countries of origin. Telecommunications was such that it was quite difficult to maintain contacts. My family scheduled one phone call a year. We had to schedule it, you had to book it, to speak with relatives in England and Australia. So younger people might not realize, but that's how it was. You registered, booked, and reserved a single phone call for a limited amount of time. By the way, those were carried through both in Australia and in the UK at the time, actually until not too many decades ago. Almost no one had a unique telephone line, so you had party lines and things. You had no privacy in those communications, and you basically had the opportunity to say a few words. Hi, we love you. That was about it. My mother had worked in Burma during the war, and she had been part of a women's auxiliary service in Burma and developed close relations with many Burmese women. And she was able for some time to write letters, but then because that's how communications were, letters, you waited for weeks or months for the letters. And then under the what became known as the bamboo curtain, under post-independent regimes in Burma, that became impossible too. So simply communications ceased. And you had to kind of imagine about people and relationships. And I want to underline that because, notwithstanding the difficulties in communications and the distances, which underlined a kind of conceptual of us and them and where we were. They were over there, we were over here. In fact, we were already living in a world which was interdependent, but we had not fully realized the degrees of interdependence. And that existed in certain domains, particularly security domains. But today, we live in a hyper-complex, interdependent world. And these ideas, I'll come back to it later, about over there and over here, are misconceptions of our actual lived experience today. Today, we're connected online, but connected online, through these little devices, we can be simultaneously connected anywhere in the world. In fact, I have posed this question to a number of people. No one's really given me a good answer. But for example, yesterday I had a meeting online with people in 5 different countries about a situation in a 6th different country. And we met through this somehow. And my question is, where did we meet? Where was it? I was here. They were in 5 other countries. We talked about a 6th. I don't quite know the technology, how it was rooted, who controlled it. I'm assuming there were multiple connections, and I don't know who was secretly watching or listening and so forth, but it was simultaneous. So this fundamental conception of us and them, we and they, over there, over here, is today a false, imagined conception. We are now quite literally living in one world. And this doesn't extend to very simple things such as climate change, pandemics, cryptocurrency. What is a cryptocurrency? Where does that fit in the Westphalian paradigm? So, but these are very real, very powerful, very influential. So that's a kind of prefatory remark. A couple other remarks. I had the pleasure of meeting John Humphrey a number of times. So for those of you who don't know who John Humphrey was, he was a Canadian. And after the Second World War, he was one of the early employees of the United Nations. And so some of you probably know the stories, but others who don't know it. And he was hired as the first director of the Directorate of Human Rights, as it was called in the United Nations at the time. Under the UN Charter, the Economic and Social Council it establishes a commission, one of the charter-based commissions on human rights. And that commission became famous because, among other things, it turned almost immediately to elaborate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we famously see the photo of Eleanor Roosevelt unfurling a big print of the big Universal Declaration of Rights. And there was a half a dozen or so very well-known people involved. René Cassin from France, who later became a Nobel laureate, and so forth, who are attributed as being the principal drafters of the Universal Declaration of Rights. But I can tell you, because I've been a UN staff member for many, many years and other intergovernmental, but you can imagine there are these kind of quiet, no-name civil servants who actually carry the bag and hold the pen and do all the drafting. And that was a guy named John Humphrey, John Peters Humphrey. And so he is actually the person who held the pen, listening to all the discussions from Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin and others, and put together the actual text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which went through variations and then was adopted at the UN General Assembly. By the way, just for those who sometimes get this wrong, nobody signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so this is a legal point I have to make. It was a resolution. It was adopted by a single vote. There were some abstentions, but it was never voted upon. And it might surprise you to know that Canada at the time, in the different drafts of it, voted consistently against it. And it was only in the last final text that Canada voted in favor, which was, of course, Mr. Pearson, who later became the foreign minister. And they were very worried at the time because what was prevalent at the time was a very big divide of we and they, which was the Cold War. It had emerged almost immediately after the Second World War. So there's a big division between the Warsaw Pact, as it became, and the NATO Pact, or you could just say the protagonists of USA and Soviet Union. And there were a lot of concerns also ideologically that to, for example, accede to ideas of respect for economic, social, and cultural rights or group rights, that this would undermine fundamental ideological ideas, particularly in the West. And that's why after the Universal Declaration was adopted, it does include most of those things, they couldn't agree on a treaty. And what happened after that was 20 years of elaborating what became two covenants, a covenant on civil and political rights and a covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. And those became associated with the two political divides in the world for probably the next 30, 40 years, until the World Conference on Human Rights in 1993. But I want to say that John Humphrey was one of the people, because it's not a common thing I discovered to my chagrin, was a person who absolutely believed in the idea that we could not only stop future wars, but that we could actually find a modus vivendi on a global level. We could live together in conditions of more trust and confidence and well-being, which is a key term in the UN Charter, Article 55. No one talks about it, but it's actually well-being is a legal obligation of states. And John Humphrey, after he retired, he continued to come. He set up something in Canada, which exists now through an NGO called Equitas, but it was the Canadian Human Rights Education Foundation. For many decades, they ran a summer school at Prince Edward Island and then in Montreal, training NGOs and others around the world. And he used to come to the UN, to the Commission on Human Rights, which used to be just once a year, because things were slow and the diplomats needed their holidays and their time. But we used to meet for 6 weeks every year in February, March. And he would come and he would accompany some NGOs and some students. He taught at McGill Law School for a number of years and just promoted this idea based on a single conviction that we could actually address these problems, that we were not subject by nature or by our own shortcomings to be subjected to war in perpetuity and so forth. So I'm glad that you're named after the John Humphrey. I don't know if you have any other connection, but he was a gentle and self-effacing man with a remarkable background and a great example and a great Canadian. Okay, so we're to talk about transnational repression in the global context. And transnational repression, I'll just quickly say, has become a term of art in the last really recent time, 5 years probably or less. But it's not like it's new. And I mentioned the other day, yesterday, that, for example, famously, Karl Marx was pursued by Prussian agents in 1840 in London because he was writing pamphlets in Germans sent back to Prussia to foment purposefully rebellion. And of course, that was considered a threat by the Prussian state. And so they went after him not only to spy upon him, but to actually suppress the production. And he feared for his own safety. He had to protect against these interferences. So that's 100 almost 200 years ago, and not by contemporary technological means. But what it was an example of is what transnational repression exactly is. There is no legal definition of transnational repression. It's becoming a kind of political art term of art. But essentially, it's when a foreign state, meaning a state, and I would qualify this not just to say a state, I'll come back to that in a moment, but principally a foreign government, reaches beyond its territorial and personal jurisdiction. So the state, as you may know, is in the definition of the state, it's partly comprised by a permanent population and a defined territory, or roughly defined territory. And the state has jurisdiction, has lawful authority over that population and also territory. So right now, if anyone here is not a Canadian citizen, you are not under the jurisdiction of Canada on the basis of personal relationship. You're under the jurisdiction of the state territorially. You're within the territorial boundaries of the state. But for example, I am also a dual national. I hold British nationality. And anywhere I go in the world, I'm also subject to personal jurisdiction of the state of the United Kingdom. So here, as I'm standing here, I can't think of the things that I might be subject to, but I can tell you some that are typical. For example, increasingly a number of countries in the world, Canada included, requires that nationals must submit their income tax on the basis of world earnings. So they don't care where you are. They don't care where the income is derived. If you are a national of Canada, you are subject to submit at least. It doesn't mean you're subject to the taxation because there are tax treaties. There are all sorts of things. It used to be the Americans were the unique ones in that world. You're an American, you better pay taxes, and they don't care where you earn it from. It's even a problem in the UN because it's the only country in the world that does not allow an exemption from taxation for its nationals in the UN, which is a matter of diplomatic law. But as a result, many countries have followed that. So Canada now requires, and for lots of reasons, of complexity and criminality and all sorts of things, but that's an example of personal jurisdiction. That could apply to other things. For example, when you, as a Canadian, travel abroad, it might surprise you that there are certain things you, by law, are not allowed to do. You're not allowed to traffic in children, for example. Maybe that's not something you're likely to do, but you just better know you're not allowed to do it under Canadian law. Whatever the law is in the country of origin, Canadians under criminal law cannot involve in, for example, certain international criminal conduct, which would include things like child sex trade and things like that. So this idea where the government itself now is acting extraterritorially, so outside of its territorial jurisdiction, but also not only with regard to its nationals, but with regard to anyone, anywhere, so universally. So, for example, China's security law applies universally. So it applies to me right now. I'm not a Chinese national. I'm obviously not in China. But right now, and anything I say may be subject to the Chinese security law. And it is. So this is a reason to be concerned about certain things. But where the state not only projects that, it kind of arrogates to itself such a reach, but its actual conduct and practices then pursue that beyond the state, beyond its jurisdictional entitlements, and beyond the traditional international law. So traditional international law or classical international law would apply to diplomatic relations. So states exchange persons, send envoys beyond their territory. They're obviously their nationals, not the nationals of another state, and they make agreements with foreign receiving states. But they may also do something called diplomatic protection, which is where a state says, we will also confer a kind of act of protection on a national abroad for other activities. And a state is unlimited in doing that. They can, but it's also not a right. It's it's not of the individual right. So if I'm abroad, I don't have a right to Canada protecting me in, let's say, I don't know, Botswana. It's a prerogative of the state to protect. Historically, this comes from trade arrangements, Commerçant and others. Sometimes they had activities that were very important, and you wanted to promote trades. Sometimes the state would confer degrees of protection on their nationals abroad for such purposes. So that's diplomatic law regulates that. But we're not talking about diplomatic law here. We're talking about the state, because what's key to transnational repression is the repression. The state is seeking not to facilitate good relations, exchanges, and so forth. The state is seeking to repress, and I'll define that a little bit more in a moment, the conduct of actors. And it's one thing to repress within your territorial jurisdiction and with regard to your nationals. It's another thing to seek to repress anywhere in the world and within the territory of other states, including through means which would be otherwise unlawful in those states. So this is a part of the definition. Sometimes people say it's politically motivated, but here we're in a political science, political studies laboratory. Politics in this regard can pretty much be anything. It's essentially anything contrary to the desire, interest, or policy of the state, whatever that is, arts, culture, sports, really anything. The other thing I want to say about this, I already said, I'll query a little bit about the state or the government. We're now living in an era, and it's not also new, I mean, but it's become more and more acute, I would say. Some people talk about things like state capture. So who is the state? So we have our formalities. We have our new Governor General, I think today was, if I'm not mistaken, Louise Arbor took up her, what's the word? I can't think of the right word. Not installed, but instead, I'll say she took up her position as Governor General, and there's a formality to that position. We have, of course, our head of government, the Prime Minister. We have governments in council, federal, provincial, and so forth. And that's the government, which forms part of the state. But what we're seeing more and more is that there are actors who are proxies of the government or are so close and having effective influence and control that it really queries who is the government. And this is, again, not new historically. You know, in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company, for example, if you think 400 years ago, East Indian Company, the Dutch East Indian Company. So that idea of the closeness of a corporate interest, private interest, and the state, and effectively usurping state authority for private interests, that's not new. But now it's become quite remarkably complex and integrated. So we think about the tech brothers, the tech bros in Washington, and we think about Palantir in the UK, the whole Mandelson inquiry now, which is covered up and controlled. Who is acting for whom? And where is this in the state? So they usurped the instruments of the state for private interests. And that includes security mechanisms, including instruments of repression. So I want to just broaden the idea from what it's often talked about as the state. I want to think about what do we mean by that and how far does it go? So you can already see this idea of transnational repression is very large if you start to reflect upon it, almost unlimited. The essence of the repression is to silence, to intimidate, silence, to constrain by almost any means. I'll count some of them, but it's an almost unlimited means. And that goes to all ends, including the taking of life, assassinations. And we've had it happening in Canada, which is shocking to many people, and we still don't have satisfactory outcomes. So, for example, a couple of years ago in Surrey, BC, a Khalistani nationalist, so a Punjabi Sikh leader who's committed to an independent Punjab, what they call Khalistan, advocating for this, and by means which may be legitimately questioned between states, also uses of violence, for example, political violence. But he was in broad daylight in the middle of a crowd, assassinated by almost certainly agents of the Indian state. In Canada, and to my knowledge, still there has been no justice returned in terms of arrestations or criminal charges laid against individuals. So in many other parts of the world, this has become fairly more common. But let me just go over a few things about who we're talking about, both as those at risk, particularly in those who are perpetrators, and then maybe some of the means. So who's at risk? Potentially anyone. And I'll even come back to my own case in a moment. But typically dissidents, particular kinds of dissidents, those who would be political opponents, political opposition, political party opposition. So many countries forbid certain political movements, ideologies, actors. If you're part of those, then you're not only excluded politically, but you may be criminalized. So under Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, for example, the Dawa Party, the communists, various parties were not only illegal, but criminalized and subject to the death penalty, by the way. So this is also true for many other states still today. So political opposition or dissidents are core. Human rights defenders, peacemakers. Human rights defenders can apply to an extremely broad swath of people, women's rights activists, labor leaders. In different countries of the world, these different categories have higher or lower risk. For many, many years, the riskiest place to be, if you were a labor leader, was Colombia. Labor leaders were on an almost daily basis, killed on a weekly basis, multiple killings. Peacemakers, peace builders, are trying to kind of address the sources and the perpetuation and the investments in conflict. Democracy and rule of law advocates, anti-corruption advocates, environmentalists. And we look at places like Nigeria and the Delta with oil largely is extracted. Many of the local people who are simply environmentalists trying to protect their environment in which they live were obviously agitating for political change. They became opposition. They became targeted, including again assassinations. Ethnic and minority leaders, many of them, Indigenous peoples here in Canada also. Journalists as such are a very common target of such means of repression because they are purveyors and amplifiers of the acts of others, and they're also instruments of I wouldn't say truth sayers, but they contribute to the clarification of things in the public domain. And a lot of that is subject to repression because those in authority don't want it to be shared. Public servants, it might surprise you, but a lot of public servants, if people stand up in their public authority, to administer the law fairly or to do whatever they're supposed to do, and they don't bend to the will of power, then they may be also subject to instruments of repression. So public servants individually in number have had to flee their countries of origin because they were associated with opposition. I would more broadly say people who resist and people who rebel, which is a pretty darn large swath of people in the world. And this brings us to the question of who are the perpetrators. Basically, authoritarian, autocratic actors who try to reduce or eliminate opposition. They don't want resistance. They want compliance. They want servile populations, and they want to be able to essentially dictate. We're seeing a lot of this south of the border right now through different means. There are those in the last few years, particularly led by an NGO in the US called Freedom House, which has about 5 years ago started publishing, maintaining a database of individual cases that they would investigate, examine. They now have about almost 1,500 cases in their database, so corroborated with a high degree of certainty in terms of what they're alleging to have happened. Within this, I can tell you that in as little as the last 4 years, 4 years ago, they had identified 38 countries as perpetrator states. So that's about 1/4 of the world's, 1/5 of the world's countries. And now, as of earlier this year, January, they now say 54 states. So that's more than 1/4 of the world's states, significant increase. but acting now in more than 100 states, 107 states, as 193 states members of the UN, as you may know. So well over half the states in the world are subject to cases that have been established. There are 5 states that are responsible for 80% of these cases. And the one at the top of the list by far is China, which has really institutionalized and has a public policy, governmental policy of transnational repression, which we can talk about. The other states are Russia, Turkey, particularly if you include the attacks on the Gunis movement, Iran, and Rwanda. But there are others. So in Canada, for example, you might not know, but we were subject to forms of transnational repression by Saudi Arabia. And there are many other examples. I mentioned, again, this is not just the state, it's the state through certain proxies or allies. So it's not so simple as saying, for example, in the case of the Indian agents of their security service, it appears to have been actual members of the service, but it may not have been. And it may have been persons contracted. So, I mean, legally, they would still be agents, but they're not, for example, government staff, corporations, which are maybe instruments of the state. Certain countries, for example, China. My understanding is no corporate board now exists absent a CCP member. Maybe I'm wrong about that. My understanding is that it's virtually impossible to have a significant corporate body absent a CCP member. So there is no such thing as a purely independent actor anymore. And that's true of other countries too. And what we see, well, I'll talk about trends in a moment, but we see that the numbers and the breadth is certainly augmenting rapidly. And there are reasons for that. What are the means? I've already mentioned assassinations, but other common means are forms like renditions. You might know of the Hussein Chalil case, a Canadian of Uyghur origin from Toronto. I think he was 16 years, a Canadian citizen, his family in Toronto. And he was in, I think, Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. I now can't recall. I think Uzbekistan and China, and he entered as a Canadian. So he was in Uzbekistan as a Canadian. But China identified him. China didn't recognize, from China's perspective, he was a Chinese person. He remains a Chinese person under the Chinese perspective. So they did not respect his change of nationality, which is, by the way, a right under the Universal Declaration of Rights. You have a right to seek. You don't have a right to another nationality, but you have a right to seek it. And he sought it and obtained it. So in international, he is also a Canadian, or became a Canadian. Anyway, he was, the Chinese requested that he be arrested and returned to China, which he did, which they did, and he has been. And our government has, under the Harper government, it was regularly referenced in exchanges with China, but under the Trudeau government, they stopped asking. And actually, when we had the two Michaels and the three M's, as we call it, case, you might remember Dominic Barton, who was the Canada's ambassador, head of McKinsey, which had 50% of their business in China. He actually claimed he had never heard of Hussein Chalil, and then he said, "Oh yeah, isn't that Chinese guy with some Toronto?" No, he's a Canadian citizen. And I would only just say, I don't think Dominic Barton's a stupid guy. So I think this reflects something serious about Canadian public policy. So renditions, deportations, detentions, but effects on family members. So a lot of the transnational repression is not carried out against the individual targeted, but against their interests and their associates and family members. So there's an argument here about not just guilt by association, to use that phrase, but the form of repression is effective by threatening not me, but threatening my family, my relations, my interests. Contemporary transnational repression, although, as I say, I mean, the Prussians did this to Karl Marx, surveillance, Well, now we live in a world with amazing abilities to survey. And I guess I should have put this in a box or thrown it out or something. So it's probably surveyed right now. I can tell you, by the way, a lot of diplomatic corps now, when you go to headquarters or various meetings, they have boxes. You can't have meetings. They put them in, I forget what they're called, sound boxes. And so they don't meet with any open telecommunications anymore because this is it's becoming ubiquitous. We're not imagining it. This is really happening. Cyber attacks are very common, including major attacks on reputations. So there's one technique which has proved to be very effective is the destruction of people's reputations through attribution of pornographic conduct, for example. So China has done this with quite a lot of women. Women are particularly vulnerable to this. So a woman who might have been just even a friend of someone who was associated with suddenly appears in their social media feeds with associated very active pornographic activity. Very hard to get rid of it, very hard to dispel it. I mean, it's really awful. And you can imagine within certain cultural contexts what a powerful effect that is. All sorts of disruptions on ordinary life activities, identity documents, financial interests, bank accounts, status questions, certification, your professional, suddenly you'll discover that your degrees you earned at some university no longer can be found, or they've been wiped from the record of having earned it. All sorts of things like this. Administrative forms of repression. For example, withholding of passports, not renewing them, visas, I mentioned also bank accounts, work permits. Again, not just you, but it might be your family or someone else. So you might think you got a brother you haven't seen in 20 years. And suddenly they discover they're not getting renewal of a business visa somewhere. And it turns out that's what has happened. And all sorts of harassments, everything from direct phone calls and direct activities, physical surveillance of private homes. I'm talking about here in Canada. I mean, this is, so you may have probably heard of, if you don't know more about, foreign police stations that are undeclared, but also through the use of infiltration techniques. So, for example, professors, students, university research arrangements will be infiltrated by agents of the state who then use those relationships to not just survey, but also to influence and sometimes threaten. As part of that, there have been renditions affected. People have been brought into meetings and then actually kidnapped and taken away. You may know that, for example, in Canada, there are people, I live in Ottawa, and I know that there are persons in Ottawa who are subject to bounties, foreign bounties. So yeah, there's almost no limit to the means of this kind of activity. Okay, what are the trends in this? Well, one of the first trend that won't surprise you is the world has been on for many years now, a trend of diminishment of democracies and increase of autocracies. So the first problem is that there are simply more and more states that are autocratic and are not just prone to, but adopt these techniques in the normal forms of their politics, repression, their repressive societies. These states are also getting richer. And in addition, they're increasingly actively cooperating. So they're not one-on-one, they are talking to each other. And the technology of this has diminished the cost and extended the reach. So a poor state, which might not have diplomatic representation and so forth, but through telecommunications, through cooperation, techniques they've learned, are now able to extend and project the repression abroad. And I'll give you a personal example of a case I had. I mentioned it yesterday. As Renee said, I was director of the Human Rights Center for a number of years at the University of Ottawa. And one day, about a year and a half ago, a gentleman came to my office and he was well dressed and so forth. And he knocked on the door and he was a bit agitated. And he asked, he said, I need some help. I'm in trouble. Can you help me? And so first of all, I said, we're an academic center, it's not what we do exactly, but how can I help? What are you asking? So he was a businessman from Tunisia. And he said, so I'm here in Ottawa, I've been in Toronto, Montreal, elsewhere, and my passport is soon to expire. So I came to Ottawa to the Tunisian embassy to renew through the consular services my passport. They took the passport. 2 days later, he gets called back to them, and not about renewing his passport, but they want to talk to him. And they said, we see on your social media, you've been criticizing the president of Tunisia and the Tunisian state. So first of all, he was pretty shocked that they would check him on this, but they said straight to him, we will not renew the passport unless you remove these and stop criticizing. He was not happy about that. And they said, well, if you don't do that, we know where your family members live. We will act against your business in Tunisia. Basically, we'll make it impossible for you to conduct your business, and your family members pay penalty. So he came, said, what do I do? And I don't know what he does. I don't know what the answer is to that. Do I call the RCMP? What is the RCMP going to do? They're not going to arrest the Tunisian. So there are immunities. In the worst case, there could be persona non grata, whatever, this kind of things, diplomatic. This isn't going to help him personally. It's not going to solve his problem. So just to say that Tunisia is not a powerful, big state, but they have adopted clearly a fairly simple and quite effective means of extending repression beyond their state, in this case to a national, but in Canada, and has effects on Canada, right? Its business partners and whomever. A lot of the autocracies in the cooperation are now operating through multilateral arrangements. So not just things like BRICS and all the rest of it, but on a bilateral basis. So it's very well known, for example, renditions of Uyghurs from Thailand not too long ago, or from Vietnam relations, so bilateral relations, China, Vietnam, China, Thailand, and so forth, China, Uzbekistan, the stance, so Russia, Belarus. I mean, we could go through them. There are lots of these kind of relations very clearly for purposes they find it in their shared common interest to participate in joint operations of repression transnationally outside their frontiers. The second thing I want to identify is a real problem, and this is the heart of what I'm concerned about in Canada, is the vulnerability of open societies. So the problem with an open society is that we're open. It's the definition of our society. And so what we're finding is that transnational repression has identified the vulnerabilities and is weaponizing these vulnerabilities. And this creates a dilemma, because the means of responding to it implies certain securitization of otherwise open spaces. But if you don't, then you are simply vulnerable. These are being used by bad actors, or whatever you want to call them. So this includes our media. This includes, for example, our elections. It includes academic bodies, includes our civil servants. It's relatively not difficult to become a Canadian citizen. I mean, a lot of refugees will tell us it's way more difficult, but relatively speaking, I mean, I lived in Switzerland for many years, and it takes you 10 to 12 years minimum to become a Swiss national. And by the way, it has to be approved at a commune level. It's not even at a state or a canton level. So not so easy. Canada has always been open to and relatively receptive of immigration. We talked about our own families and so forth, and even, inviting it. And so it's not too difficult. I've had many students that came as foreign students, then they stayed on and worked a couple of years, got permanent residency, and got citizenship a couple of years after that. Not that difficult in terms of a passage. But that's also not a difficult route for means of infiltration. So persons who come, I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, so I worked for the UN in the early 1990s, in the 80s and 90s, but I investigated serious violations of human rights by, among others, Iraq under the Ba'athist regime, Saddam Hussein. And Iraq, what you should not, a lot of people would look pejoratively at, Iraq, a Middle Eastern country. I know people have very simplistic ideas, Arab, Muslim, and with pejorative connotations, underdeveloped, barbaric, or whatever. Iraq is a cradle of civilization. highly educated, 98% literate society, oil-rich, computerized. Iraq, in terms of numbers of doctors and engineers, really impressive. By the way, pretty high standards under the Ba'athist of status of women. And that might surprise you, but relatively speaking, it was. But they also were hyper authoritarian, and they did not tolerate any opposition. So Iraq had the highest percentage of foreign students in the Arab world studying abroad because they had the money and the means and intellectual capacity. But you could not get a scholarship and you could not be abroad unless you accepted Ba'ath Party surveillance, in fact, membership. And every single Iraqi student abroad had to report. There was a parliamentary commission done by the British Parliament on this in the 1980s because it became so bad in terms of basically they had enough complaints by Iraqi students and all sorts of deleterious activity connected with it. But in Canada, come back to Canada, we do things which sound very sensible. For example, if we have a Department of Trade that wants to enhance trade with China, probably a good idea to have people who know something about China, probably Mandarin speakers, and so forth. Well, wouldn't it make sense if we had some new Canadians of Chinese origin as those staff members who happen to earn a PhD in, hydrocarbon trade and stuff? Or for example, during the pandemic, our relationships with, for example, research labs and so forth. Again, kind of naively, as Canada, we think, oh, well, great, the Chinese have some great scientists and great relationships. We're not paying attention to what the role of the People's Liberation Army is or what the relationship. And we kind of ignore it in the US because, in the US, there's almost no research done that's not somehow connected to the Defense Department. Or, I taught for a year in Boston. It was quite surprising to me, the physical presence of military and defense establishment in ordinary American universities. They're just pervasive because they have an enormous amount of money. And now it's getting bigger, right? So we kind of, okay, is that a terrible thing? Well, if you're not paying attention, it's one thing to have such persons who are not subject to these kind of influences. But if they are subject to these influences, and I'm not saying these are people who had malintention, but they may be instrumentalized for those purposes. So this is a question of vulnerability that you have to think about. And it's a dilemma for the open society because you cannot prejudicially preclude, for example, a person of Chinese origin from having a job in the civil service. You can't do that. So now you have to think, okay, what are we doing? I can tell you practices of many organizations, Amnesty International, for example. I was the director of an intergovernmental organization in the OSCE, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. We had certain practices where, for example, we tried never to have a Russian or an American in our unit because these were conflictual elements, but we were always not just sure about who exactly they worked with or their relations, but we were also concerned about perceptional issues. So, for example, we never had a Hungarian work on Hungarian minority issues in Central Europe. Because if their name was whatever Hungarian name, no matter what their politics were, as soon as they went anywhere, all the other people would immediately react to them as Hungarian. And the fact is, they do have belongings and histories and families and so forth. So there are certain ways in which many countries, for example, a lot of Eastern European countries and others, do not allow a dual national to be head of state or head of government or head of foreign affairs or certain institutional positions. This came up in Canada. You might remember when Stephen Harper was criticizing Stéphane Dion because his mother is French. Stéphane Dion is a dual national of France. He's got a pied-à-terre at Paris, so he must be somehow untrustworthy. But it raises a kind of fair question because there are these complex issues, not just about allegiance or, let's say, the bad intention of an individual, but they're subject to possible instrumentalization. And we would be stupid to close our eyes to the potential of these kind of influences. So the open society is a problem in this regard. I'm totally in favor of the open society, but we probably have to scrutinize and be more careful. The academy is particularly subject to this. So professors, research grants, partnerships, students, increasingly who controls journals, who funds and controls conferences. All of this is now a problem. The third trend to look at is the problem of mobility. I already mentioned the way in which we move around the world and control over ID documents, passports, visas, but also for security purposes. So, for example, the role of Interpol, which has now been instrumentalized by foreign transnational repressive states. So we've had, for example, very famous case in Ottawa, with which we've worked, a woman from who is part of the human rights defender in Russia, fled Russia, came to Canada. Russia slapped her with a criminal charge, tried her in absentia. And then when Canada did a search on her with regard to conferring on her protected status in Canada, it came up that she's a criminal from Russia. And they were not going to give her protection and even send her back. And this became a very public case. And a lot of people intervened. And then the government changed the position. But this is not a rare case. So it's one of the instruments that's used is slapping criminal charges on persons that are completely bogus charges. But they know that this now makes it very impossible for these people to travel, to get status abroad, and so forth. Outsourcing, another problem we do. So I don't know if you've tried to get a visa in certain places, but by the way, people are trying to come to, I have a person hoping to come and study with me. She's just got a big award. I won't say from which country, but from a country in the South, which is associated with transnational repression. But where does she apply for a visa? She does not apply to Canada. She applies to Canada through an outsourced company, which is an Indian company functioning in, I forget where, in southern India. And I think the office she has to apply to is in Manila. These are private firms in foreign countries delivering sovereign functions, Canadian sovereign functions. This is routine now. And by the way, if you tried to get a passport, you pay a lot more money for a passport, because some years ago, our Canadian government said, you know what, consular affairs, that's expensive. Why should ordinary Canadians that don't travel abroad? I think this was under Harper, was a little bit upset about it. So they now charge a lot more. It costs you like $160 to get a passport. And so that money goes into a fund. Canada has a consular services fund derived from all this income to cover our costs. So it's not even a cost argument, is what I'm saying. That fund is now hundreds of millions, or it could be well over $500 million. I'm sure it is. Why are we outsourcing a sovereign act to an Indian company functioning out of Manila? But that's a vulnerability, right? A couple more things I'll go through. Telecommunications is the big one. We do live by these little devices, and we can't avoid them. It's almost impossible. You may know that Canadian pension plan services, old age services increasingly are now requiring that you have smartphone. There's a lot of people, older generations don't have smartphones, can't afford smartphones, don't know how to use smartphones. But so this, if you look at the United Kingdom right now, Palantir has got contracts with the National Health Services, contracts, this quite shocking level of interposition and risk. So telecommunications, media, data surveillance, infrastructure systems. For example, just a week ago, it was reported a Chinese person in the United Kingdom was subject to, or was felt threatened, subject to something, and the person called a police service in Cornwall, southwestern England. And he was agitated. He was there with his family. His English wasn't that good. So they said, would it help if you spoke with someone in Mandarin? He said, yes. So they got a Mandarin speaker online. The Mandarin person then started admonishing him for impugning the reputation of the Chinese state. And this person then turns out to be the official interpreter for some UK police services on a large contract, something like £130,000 annual salary paid for by the British government. and they did not convey his complaint to the police service. So this raises a question, what are these services doing, right? But that's civil service, that's police servicing, that's the infrastructure of the state. There's also the physical infrastructure of the state, water systems, air systems, and so forth. There's repression and cultural grounds. You may know that there were threats against, now I forget the name of it, in Toronto, but 2 weeks ago, it's a not theater, performance group, does dance, and I can't remember the name of the group at the moment. But there were threats against of bombs or insecurity in Toronto. They canceled all the concerts. And that's because the group, which is, I think, associated with Falun Gong, is an enemy of the Chinese state. So this is but this is in Toronto. Canadians freely should be able to go see a concert, right? How is this subjected to this kind of interference? So I could go on, but this form of engagement, a lot of it through persons and technology in communications and what we know in our media, is now become a huge, huge issue. Okay, I want to just remark a few things and then we can, oh, I forgot to mention, yeah, kind of obvious one, money. So a lot of the repressive states used to be poor or limited. They're not poor anymore. So they're rich and they have money. And so problems of bribery, compromising politicians. There have been several cases in the United Kingdom and elsewhere now, US and elsewhere. There's some questions about Canadians and politicians and others about who actually they're serving and who's paying for their campaigns, who's controlling them. And that might not be through states, but state agents through corporations and others that they have business partnerships with. But there's a lot of money in this now to buy influence. And so that's another, I would say, vulnerability with our kind of market systems. And interestingly, our government has not wanted to clamp down on this with regard to political activity because they don't want political party scrutiny and so forth. There's a very big problem here about our own politicians having a degree. We saw that through the foreign interference inquiry. They don't really want to subject themselves to a strong, for example, public interest political party arrangement. They want to control it themselves for whichever purpose they want. Well, that means they perpetuate the vulnerability. Yeah, so a few things I want to say about conceptually. I've already referenced this. The world has changed tremendously, and this Westphalian paradigm of the state coinciding nation, territory. By the way, that's basically it's an 18th century European idea. The state is an older idea, territory, population, but the idea of nation, one nation, that's a blip in history, as some people have said. It's a very active one. It's a very real one. But I would suggest to you, we have to rethink this basic fundamental idea, this single idea of the state being bounded by territory, geography, for example. Geography is important. Canada's not going to not be located north of the United States of America. We're not going to escape that. But, for example, in an information economy, a technology economy, we don't necessarily have to have our wagon hitched to the US for example, for natural resources. I mean, Canada remains overwhelmingly a hewer of wood and a carrier of water, or drawer of water, as the phrase was. Yes, we're still largely that kind of an economy, but you may also know that the biggest elements of our economy are housing, building, management. We count a lot of things, administration, accounting, and so on. And increasingly, information technologies and so forth will be the basis of well-being and wealth and so forth. This is not dependent upon geography. Until Hong Kong was basically, let me say, changed, absorbed in China, contrary to the agreement with the United Kingdom. Two places in the world, Hong Kong and London, was a physical location of 50% of all financial transactions. That's the world in which we live in. 50% of all financial translation in 2 places. So it's not about physical geography anymore. We can press a button and transfer the complete wealth that far exceeds the wealth of entire countries in seconds through telecommunications. That's not moving bullion on a ship. So we have to rethink the ideas of geography, and specifically the Westphalian idea. The state is increasingly becoming weak. If you look at the Global Fragility Index, which is followed, about two-thirds of the world's states are now in the failed, failing, fragile category. More than half of the world's states. Many states are not able to affect the classic state. They cannot actually control their frontiers. They cannot actually control, particularly against this kind of transnational repression activity. They can't do it. They don't have the means. Last September, I was asked by the Organization of American States to advise them on conduct of elections in conflict situations. But we did a survey of member states on, among other things, their own fragility for electoral integrity. And 90% of OAS states reported that they have been victims of all sorts of interferences, including 1/3 of them subjected their members to deep fakes that attack the integrity of the individual, for example, commissioners of elections and so forth. Now, just imagine in the OAS, we're talking about a lot of micro states, little Caribbean states. They have absolutely no technical or other means to protect against this. So how sovereign is that state? How effective is it? And it's not at all. It's not at all. Won't surprise you that a couple of narco traffickers took over some states, Dominica in the Caribbean, also a West African state, Guinea-Bissau was basically taken over by narco traffickers in conjunction with transnational corporate, basic criminal actors. So our idea of the state is simply not cohering with the actual challenges we're facing, and transnational repression kind of highlights that. The fact is that we live with these kind of multiple relationships. In Canada, we have 4 million dual nationals. I'm one. 4 million. We're actually not sure, but we think it's at least 4 million. That's 4 million people particularly subject to influences of states that may have ill intent. And the majority of states, according to Freedom House, there's only about 10 full democracies left in out of 195. So we need to realize this vulnerability is not marginal. It's not something in the future. It's here now, and it's substantial. So I think I'll end there. I'll just, not to end on entirely depressing way, saying that I will just say that there are things to be done about this. And my view is that the first thing is that Canada needs to get our heads out of the sand. We need to realize that that this is the world in which we live. I mean, Carney said we shouldn't live in the world. We shouldn't govern the world we wish it to be. We have to live in the world the way it is. Okay, the way it is it's really dangerous, and we are very vulnerable. That means we need to develop our services. We do not have services. We don't have an integrated service that deals. If you are subject to a Transnational Repression Act, it's not clear who you call. They've now assigned someone in the RCMP, but the RCMP won't know what to say about a lot of these activities. So there is increasing cooperation between many states. And actually, there are efforts in the European Union in particular, but also the Council of Europe at a multilateral level, even new conventions being elaborated to see how states can cooperate. But I think here in Canada, the first thing we need to do, our Prime Minister needs to, within the Privy Council, appoint a full-time person. This is an urgent matter of national interest, national security, of integrity of our democracy, of a societal character. And so we need someone who drives this at a political level. We need, in my view, and I've recommended this to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, we also need an interministerial working group, because this is not one ministerial responsibility. It's transversal. It's many ministries involved. It's very complex. And government doesn't work very well at the transversal level. So we need, one way to do that is create a interministerial working group. I think we need to establish an expert scientific body that looks at this, really has research competences, but also has experts who can think about ideas of how to counter. We are behind the curve. We need to get ahead of the curve. At the moment, chances of catching up to the curve are not good. But unless we really bring the best minds, the capabilities together, we're not going to. The perpetrators will stay ahead of us. We need training across all of the relevant public services to be aware of. Local police stations have no idea what to do about this kind of thing. And I have some other recommendations for intergovernmental cooperation. I also suggest, because I think it's this big of a deal, I think we might even want to talk about a royal commission or some kind of national commission. This is not something that's going to go away. It's not going to get smaller. And I think we really need the attention of the country. We need to consult the country. We live in a hyper diverse society now. I don't know how Edmonton is, but Toronto is identified as one of the most diverse places in the world. Half of the population of Toronto born in a foreign country, 400 languages spoken every day in Toronto. There are relationships where money goes, like all sorts of things happen. So we need to focus broadly on that, and I think maybe we need a royal commission. Thank you for giving me the attention. I've spoken quite long, but I'm happy to respond to any questions.